Welcome, everyone, to a bonus edition of Monday Match Analysis. Today's episode is a conversation with Jeff Sackmann. He is the founder and the creator of a website I use religiously to follow and cover this sport, tennisabstract.com, a database with statistics, head-to-head results, and a lot of important metrics and historical database-like features that are an invaluable resource, in my opinion. So I wanted to talk to Jeff not only about the website, which I'm sure anyone who uses it regularly will really enjoy this conversation, but if you don't use Tennis Abstract, if you're unfamiliar with it, we talk about numbers and analytics and data and how numbers could affect tennis. Obviously, tennis is a sport which is kind of behind other sports when it comes to metrics, when it comes to advanced analytics. I think if you're a soccer fan or a basketball fan or a hockey fan, you can see that. You can see that in other sports. It's a much bigger part of the general discourse, how the sport is covered, how the sport is talked about. Statistics, advanced statistics are more available, and tennis is far behind. It's very much in the Stone Age when it comes to the numbers game. It's a topic that fascinates me, and I was really excited. I have been for a long time to chat with Jeff about that. Also, some Australian Open talk, just a little bit. We did record this before the Australian Open began, just to timestamp it briefly. So without further ado, here's Jeff Sackmann. We're joined for the first time by Jeff Sackmann, the founder of Tennis Abstract, a database that I do not go a day without using. It's got player pages, stats, rankings, head-to-head data, and blog posts, podcasts as well. And Jeff, has been a long time coming. I literally cannot, and I'm sure you've gotten this before, I can't imagine covering the sport without the resource you've created. So I know if you're like most people, you don't want to start by talking about yourself, but do you ever think about that? How it's like the fourth largest sport in the world, and the website that you created on your own is kind of a vital part of keeping up to date with the history of it and the data?
Well, I have to first say, you really think most people don't want to start out by talking about themselves? Who are you talking to, Gill? Who are these people who don't want to talk about themselves? I guess if I have to, I will. I don't ever think about that. I think one thing that'll take a much longer time before it changes is that most people don't use my site. I mean, it's flattering to hear people like you and people like Alex Bruskin and many of my friends talk about it, because I know, I mean, like I've told many people over the years, I built this site to scratch my own itch. Like, this is what I wanted to use. I wanted to follow the sport and I wanted to follow it my way. So that's where the site came from. And I know it does scratch that itch for a lot of people, and that's fantastic. On the other hand, I think if you went down row by row through people in Rod Laver Arena, even the hardcore tennis fans these next couple of weeks, like the people who care about stats, they're mostly looking at the FedEx or whatever leaderboards on the ATP site. And maybe that's enough for them. That's fine. But I mean, honestly, I'd much rather that the ATP and the WTA did a much better job on their site and delivered something that is what I'm delivering or better to everyone. So, I mean, most people don't dig deeper into the weeds and find stuff like my site. But, you know, since this is the state we're in, then great. I mean, I it's mostly automated now. So like I'm not that different from you. Like, a lot of mornings I wake up and check my site, see what's going on, see what the updated probabilities are, check out a head-to-head. It's not like I need to invest a ton of time in it every day. But I mean, it's fantastic that it's gotten the kind of traction and helped people the way it has.
If it's to scratch an itch that you've always had, I'm curious, what are the features on the site that you go back to most often, and what are the ways that you most often use it?
The funny thing is, I don't think a lot of people like the way that I show tournament draws, because it's just a list of names, and maybe I've just gotten used to it, but to me that's the way I want to see a tournament draw. I just want to see a list of names in order. I want to see what the probabilities are, because that gives me just a one second, one glance snapshot of who the favorites are, what the close matches are in the next round. Um, to me, it's all there. If I look at the old fashioned, like the with the lines and all that stuff, like it just the seeds and qualifier indications, the traditional draw display, it doesn't do it for me. Like I can read it obviously, but I feel like there's so much information missing there, that I'm just used to seeing the sort of the probability map of the rest of the tournament. Um, and it probably came about because I'm not very good at web design, and I just like tables. But since I've been looking at it for 10 years, that's what I love to see. So I guess that's it. But also I love being able to slice and dice the data. So if I'm looking at a head to head and I'm like, well, maybe we don't care about the first 3 years of this head to head. So you filter it down to when one of the players cracked the top 10 or something. Just there's so many factors that go into every tennis stat you might want to dream up, that you're always thinking, well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? And the way that the site is set up, you're always one click away from another variation like that. So you can kind of follow where your mind naturally goes without having to do a ton more work, or without having to just give up and say, well, this is important, but I guess we'll never know, or maybe I'll have to wait until somebody writes about it. It's all there. You can do all that yourself. And to me, that's the genius of sites like Baseball Reference, which is like 100 times greater than my site will ever be. Like, you are wondering about anything, if you're on Baseball Reference, you're 2 clicks away from the answer. It's incredible. And I just hope to do 1% of that.
Yeah. So I have a friend in baseball analytics who works for a major league club, and
Who is it?
we like to compare notes. Jake Greenberg,
What team does he work with?
the Diamondbacks.
Okay.
Um, we like to compare notes about tennis versus baseball, and Jeff, how that's going to go. Tennis is in the dark ages. Baseball is 20 years ahead of it. And I don't want to, with this conversation, lose the international audience that doesn't know baseball, but just to give a little bit of a flavor for those listening, baseball fans are interested in the rate at which the ball spins, basically an RPM. They are interested in, or they can have access to, I should say, the speed at which the ball leaves the bat, the average angle at which the ball leaves the bat. All of these things, it is so in-depth these days. Tennis doesn't quite have that. Why do you think it's behind?
Well, there's two reasons. One is what's been clear from as long as I've been doing this, is that baseball's a team sport. The financial incentives are such that, like, anybody who read Moneyball or saw the movie knows that the financial incentives are set up that if a team is willing to get smart, sort out the data, figure out what analytics are worth doing, then you can make money. Like, there are millions of dollars on the table for teams that are willing to figure out the analytics. And when there are millions of dollars on the table, people usually chase them. It's funny how that works. And in tennis, you can make an argument that there's some money being left on the table, but by whom exactly? Like, it's not like Max Eisenbud is sitting in an office deciding who to draft to be his starting second baseman or his starting server for the 2022 season. There's just nothing like it. So if you really push, you can come up with some examples. Like, maybe players would be better off if they had better analytics. Maybe. I'm not convinced, but there's an argument to be made there. Maybe sponsors would do a better job of selecting players if they knew better who was likely to become great. That's tough because sponsors are often picking their best players when they're 13. I mean, do we honestly think that analytics are going to tell us which 13-year-olds are going to be great? Maybe. I mean, it can't hurt, but
it's not, you're right though. It's not worth it for Adidas to go those lengths to figure out who's going to be good.
Yeah, so maybe there's some benefit in, you know, Nike developing this stuff for their existing players. I don't know, but the point is there's no clear benefit to there's no clear incentives for developing the analytics. So what it falls back to is, do the tours care about providing something to their fans that there isn't a huge demand for? I mean, in our little world, it feels like there's a lot of demand, because I mean, you might talk to 10 people or 20 people in a day, and maybe 15 of them would say, oh, I really want better stats. But I mean, let's be honest here. This is a very selective sample. Walking down the roads at Rod Laver Arena next week, 99 out of 100 people wouldn't even know what you're talking about. So it would be great if the tours did it. I think it would attract a lot more fans who are the sort of baseball crossover fans who want to know about launch angle, but it's just not there. I promise there are two reasons, and I'll try to be a little briefer with the second one. But the second reason is there's just no history of stat keeping. And this is what I've discovered the last year. My big project has been building out this database of historical women's tennis data. And going back to baseball, I know when I was growing up, there was this giant book called Total Baseball. And before that, even when our parents were growing up, giant books called the Baseball Encyclopedia. And I mean giant. They're like 5,000 pages, 6-point type on every page. And you want to look up any player in the history of baseball. You can get every season they played, what positions they played, what all their batting and pitching stats were, every team record, every manager's record, just, I mean, millions and millions of stats in a printed book. And that stuff was available in the 60s. There were people compiling these databases in the 1920s. That's the history of baseball. Baseball fans really care about that stuff. When I'm digging through old newspapers, I found a Philadelphia Inquirer from, I think it was the 1920s. There was a whole page, literally a full newspaper page of minor league box scores. Philadelphia's not even a minor league town. It wasn't, there were no minor league affiliates. People in Philadelphia wanted a full page of minor league box scores. I mean, I still can't even wrap my head around that. But that's what baseball is to people. It's the numbers. So I think the historical component is more important than we give it credit for. Just, if you grow up as a baseball fan, even if you don't know the first thing about analytics, if you grew up like me before Moneyball came out as a movie, then you lived and breathed the numbers. Even if all you cared about was RBI, which is, you know, the worst anti-analytical stat ever, you're still getting used to thinking this player is better because they did this thing that I can't necessarily see, but at the end of the season I can count. Tennis fans don't think like that. Tennis fans are going to see, you know, player A beat player B really badly, and they're going to think for the next year, player A is a lot better, period. They saw it. He's great. And unless there's a giant difference in the numbers, or somebody really talks them out of it, or they see another match, they're not going to change their opinion. And that's just not really how baseball fans think. So it's going to take a major change before the fans start demanding what tours could provide. And until that happens, the incentives just aren't there. Coming back to, I mean, the original point I made.
Yeah. So much to unpack. Cultural, I agree. Is there a simplicity to a mano-a-mano sport where people just don't thirst to really understand who's good, because you have a winner and a loser and that's enough? I think that those are interesting points, but I want to go to the first one about incentive with the money. If we're following the money, there's two things I can think of. There's coaching, which I think is beginning to kind of get more into the analytics, and I still don't have a clear picture of what that's looking like at the highest levels of the game. But I think even more so, there is gambling. And that's a booming industry, and there is money on the line there, because if someone can figure out an edge, and well, I guess there's two sides to it. The people making the lines want to stay ahead of everyone else so they don't lose money. And then the people against the books obviously want to predict tennis better than the book. So what do you make of those two areas of incentive?
Well, you're definitely right about gambling. I generally just steer clear of it because I'm just not super interested. But yeah, I mean, I talked to a number of people on both sides of the bets. And yeah, they really do thirst for the data, especially bookmakers. They want to have all the data they can have. And there's some gamblers who are super smart and super technical, and they use all the data that I'll put out there too. So that's a great example. I mean, if there are financial incentives, then that's where it's coming from. The downside to that is that there's no incentives for public data. The people who contact me from bookmakers and want data, like, they're willing to work with the fact that I make all my data public. They'd rather have it than not have it. But in their perfect world, they'd pay more money and they'd have it all to themselves. And that's something that baseball has managed to avoid. There was a sort of touch and go moment maybe 15 years ago or so when Pitch FX first rolled out, that a few teams wanted Pitch FX to be kept just to major league teams, not to the public. And this is the pitch speed, pitch break type of stuff that has turned into the stuff you were mentioning before. And I don't know exactly what the behind the scenes machinations were, but that data stayed public, and it has stayed public. And that's been a game changer. That means anybody like you or me or any college kid with some technical skills, they can do something really cool and, change baseball. So I'm not sure that's the incentives are in place for that to happen in tennis, but clearly there's work being done. On coaching, I'm really interested in that too. I think there is some room for coaches to make improvements. On the other hand, every once in a while, SAP or whoever sponsors a thing about coaches using tablets. I think the WTA has done it more. And I'm wondering, maybe you can think of something, Gill. Have you ever seen a coach using a tablet when there wasn't a sponsor involved?
No.
That's what I think too. Yeah.
Now, is it legal? I'm wondering if there are some regulations about. Well, I guess the thing is this: you're not supposed to be able to speak to your player, period, except in the WTA you can. So I guess the ATP rules wouldn't matter because you can't have communication technically.
Except for ATP Cup, they had a sponsor tablet thing last year.
But I did see the screen, Jeff, on the tablet, and it was the Infosys stats that you and I can look at. And by the way, that's a good thing that Infosys has expanded those services to ATP events. It used to only be available at Roland Garros and the Australian Open. So that's been an improvement just in 2022.
Yeah, that's true. So what I wonder with the bottleneck on coaching is how much information coaches can pass on to their players. Because you and I can look at some stats after the match and say, well, Zverev should have done this differently with his serve, or he should have hit more to this side. And it's easy to say that stuff in retrospect. Maybe the coach sees it happening in real time, but then you hear what coaches actually say to their players mid matches. And it's usually the most basic stuff. Like, it's basic beyond belief. And I don't say that as a criticism. I'm sure like coaches know exactly what they can and can't say to the players they're working with. But if that's the sort of level that those conversations happen, a coach can't go in and say, if on the fifth shot, I need you to move one step forward and hit a little more towards the middle instead of aiming for the corners. Like, no coach is ever going to say that to a player in the middle of the match. And ultimately, that might be the kind of stuff that analytics can tell us, is these small adjustments, the way that basketball players adjust the way that they defend against opponents. If a player is figuring out how to defend, Steph Curry, then they're going to spend a few days and work out the exact details. But if you have 16 hours to prepare for a match against Djokovic, then I don't think you're going to worry about those specific details. You're going to focus more on your own game, at least based on what I hear coaches saying. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. I know a lot of coaches and some players, they at least give lip service to the analytical stuff they have access to. So they're thinking about it behind the scenes. I just don't know how much potential there is for very, very in-depth stuff.
Yeah, I have heard coaches talk about how some players hate it when you give them too much information. And they're like, stop, I can't deal with this. And then I know like Andy Murray notoriously wants a dissertation on every opponent who he plays. So I know it differs there. And then I also think there's a difference between the short term and the long term, where I imagine there are certain trends that could be identified in the long term that might be much more digestible and almost actionable for a coach to give to a player. You agree?
Yeah, I would hope so. It's tricky to know what those are, and the thing that I wonder about, I don't know whether I've ever really sat down to try to figure this out, but it's easy to identify what a player's weaknesses are. I mean, at least at some broad level, you can look at most players and say this is their worst shot or whatever. What I don't know if that is that where they should be trying to improve? Like if you're Riley Opelka and you have this monster serve and a weak return, Gruskin and I were talking about this yesterday. Opelka seems like he has a lot of cheap points to pick up on his return. He's so bad on return. There must be some room to improve. But if you're John Isner and you've been working on your return for 20 years and it's as good as it's going to get, do you spend your time or your off season trying to get a little better on return on which you're bad? Or do you try to, eke a little bit more out of your serve and be that much more dominant? I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know. I mean, I know if you can improve your serve points won by 0.5%, or you can improve your return points won by 0.5%, you pick the weaker side. That has more payoff. Yeah. But if you're trying to work in terms of hours, like if you're going to spend, 20 hours on court working on one or the other, if you're Isner, do 20 hours on court working on your return even help at this point? I don't know. I mean, I think that would require a lot of sort of sports science studies that are really outside the scope of what I do, and certainly beyond what I think anyone has done. But I think it's an open question. So even if you do have the best analytical work done on what's happening on the court, I'm not sure that we understand exactly how that translates into the longer term. How should a coach work with a player? What should the player be working on? That would be super interesting. We're just not there or close.
Yep. One area that interests me, and we talk about keeping data for some parties keeping data for themselves. One of those is definitely in the tennis world, Hawkeye. And I think Hawkeye is probably the coolest thing as far as tennis analytics are concerned. My favorite data points, a lot of them come from Hawkeye when it comes to looking at average net clearance or average ground stroke speeds, RPM, things like that kind of tell you about how someone is hitting the ball, for example, or average height of bounce tells you a lot about a surface. And that's a big thing in matchups. But the access with Hawkeye is pretty limited. Broadcast partners get some of that. I think coaches can get some of that through tournaments. What do you make of Hawkeye? Do you think about the possibilities of that being turned into something that is user friendly, is for the fans?
I think about it, sure.
I'm not optimistic at all because, like you say, the tournaments own the data. I had some conversations a few years ago with the USTA, and they were sort of on the brink of giving me access to a lot of their data before IBM stepped in and basically said, "We are IBM. No one else gets to do any analytics," and quashed all that. So, I mean, yeah, I absolutely think about it. And the frustrating thing to me is, like you say, some of these numbers are so interesting. I would love to have full data on things like net clearance and RPMs and all this stuff. And going back to the baseball analogy where you started, not only do are fans interested in this stuff like launch angles and speed off the bat, but we know how much it matters. Like you have people figuring out, if you can increase your exit velocity by 1 mile an hour, then that translates into an expected slugging percentage of Y points more. I don't know what the numbers are, but somebody does. We in the research community know what those numbers are, or we know that there's a certain range of launch angle. You can have obviously too high of a launch angle or too low, and we just don't know what those ranges are for tennis, or we don't know what the combinations are. So we know that say more RPMs is better in some ways, but is there a point where there's too many RPMs, or if you aren't hitting the ball deep, then too many RPMs are counterproductive? I mean, we can theorize about that stuff, but we don't really know. It wouldn't take a ton of data to figure it out, but as you point out, we don't have access to it. So I know that like the Tennis Australia people, there's some people there doing interesting work with the Tennis Australia's Hawkeye data. There's not a lot beyond that, but there's a tremendous amount of potential. And like, when we're comparing to baseball, like that's the frustrating thing, is that baseball has all this amazing data, but it isn't just the data. It's the fact that data is public, and there's this huge community of people developing research solutions, analytics based on it. Tennis has the same data. I mean, Hawkeye data is basically the same stuff. In a way, it's better because in every batter pitcher matchup, there's only one point of contact, sometimes zero, often zero. In tennis, there can be 10 or 12 points of interaction between the two players. There's so much potential to research that stuff. I just think about like Cam Norrie right now, like a player who has one approach on the forehand side, one approach on the backhand side. Like, what effect does that have? I have no idea, but that would be fascinating to look into with some Hawkeye data. We could get a sense of whether players are, thrown off balance or if they're able to react and handle it. But I mean, we're so many steps from being able to know. And I mean, I do dream of the day that Hawkeye, announces their GitHub repo, or they send me an email and say, you want to take a look at our data? Here are the keys. But, honestly, that it's just not going to happen. As long as tournaments are basically the owners of their data, then you've got to get all the tournaments to work together, which means it would have to be the ATP or the WTA who would push it forward. And I mean, I've spent a lot of years watching how ATP and WTA interact with data, and I'm not optimistic based on that experience.
Well, we can dream. Something like depth. Just for example, we all agree it's so important to hit the ball deep. And we say someone like Novak Djokovic has incredible depth. We could see theoretically if he has maybe the best depth, maybe the third best depth over the course of a season. Like, that is out there. Or at least it can be out there based on the data collection. So it's just the possibilities. The more you get your head spinning, it's there's a lot there.
Well, what I wish the tours
understood better is all this stuff it's PR, it's news stories. Yeah. So you mentioned you want to know if Novak is the best over the course of a season, and that's the more important headline stat. But imagine Novak comes out, plays his first round match against whoever he's playing. Who is he playing? Oh, Kecmanovic. Okay, that'll be interesting. He comes out against Kecmanovic, and we can say Novak Djokovic hit his average backhand within X meters of the baseline, which is his best single match stat since 2016. Just hypothetically, let's say that happens. That's a big story, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we knew that, then there's so many questions we have right now about, is Novak ready? Will he be distracted? Give me that stat, and the whole story changes to, wow, not only is he ready, he's playing better than ever. I mean, PR people should love that stuff. And the more stats you have, I mean, the more you're likely to find something like that. Like, that's why baseball fans are always talking about, Aaron Judge just hit the hardest hit ball of 2022. Well, 2021, we don't know 2022 yet, but hardest hit ball of 2021, that's a news story. So I mean, there's not a direct financial incentive, but if there is going to be an incentive for the tours, it's realizing that there's so much they can sell their players based on that they don't even have an inkling about right now.
One thing that tennis does a little bit better is the single match stuff, or I should say at least tennis is more interested in the single match stuff. So you'll see how many winners and unforced errors someone hit or something simple like that, but it's out there and it's available for the most part. What there is not a lot of, and Tennis Abstract is a big help for getting some of this, is, again, over a season, the stuff that we obsess over in all other sports, whether it be as simple as who's going to score the most goals over the course of a World Cup, whatever it is, these stats that are drawn out matter. I mean, tennis, like, there's no engagement in that area, right?
Yeah, not a lot. They've kind of tried to do that with like the FedEx leaderboard stuff on the ATP site, but yeah, there's not a lot of that. And to me, again, what that gives you is context. Like, if someone plays great, I mean, no matter what what sport you're talking about, people care about what's happening today. So you look at the end of the match stat sheet, you look at the box score in baseball, and you say, no, okay, Kontaveit hit 30 winners today, and that's better than yesterday, or that's better than the girl she beat. But what I care about is, A, what's the rate stat? So, I mean, 30 winners is great, but is that 2 sets or 3? Is that, 13 games or 30? But beyond that, once you have the rate stat, is how does that compare to her season? Is that even a good day for her? I mean, I remember I think it was 6 years ago or so, there was the Djokovic-Simone match at the Australian Open where Djokovic hit, or maybe it was Simone that hit 100 unforced errors. And that was the big headline number. Simone hit 100 unforced errors. And my first thought was, well, weren't they playing for like 5 hours? I mean, is that Is it even bad? I'm not sure it's bad. Like it sounds bad. I mean, he can think of a lot of bad moments, but if you play for 5 sets and hit 100 unforced errors, like I'll bet a lot of people would do that. They just aren't, people aren't watching as closely as Djokovic, Simone. So you need to have the season-long stats to do that work, and we don't have it for unforced errors and winners and more advanced stuff. But ultimately, it comes down to the announcers at the end of the match being able to say, Kontaveit was great. She was this much better than she's been all season, or she won despite being not as good as she was in Guadalajara, or whatever the story is. But I mean, that's what analytics are. I mean, it's just being able to say, we know how good this is because we can compare it to other performances, whether the same player or similar players or the competition. And that's really hard with what tennis stats are.
Right. Or instead of saying Berrettini has one of the biggest forehands in the world, you could say he has the highest winner rate or the third highest winner rate. And by the way, to explain, I think the rate thing is important. If you track every ball, that's where you actually get the stats that put it in the proper context. I think that's so important because not a lot of tennis stats are put into rates. I noticed on Tennis Abstract, it doesn't say aces, it's ace rate. So how many serves, how many aces, there's your ace rate. And I think that's an important point. In terms of the stats that are popular that we do see in a box score, do you have any adjustments for that? Like, do you have your tennis box score? If you could change it?
I don't have a great one.
Should we say like, this is what it usually is? It's usually first serves in percentage, first serves 1, second serves 1, break points converted, winners
return
unforced
points 1.
Yeah, return points 1, which I find pretty useless, and then winners unforced errors unless it's like a 250.
Yeah, you have winners unforced errors. Although even with the higher level tournaments right now, I think the ATP, like the Infosys stats you mentioned, and the broadcast on Tennis TV are reporting different numbers for winners and unforced errors. So there are 2 separate tallies going on, and sometimes they're not even close. But I mean,
sounds right.
First off, I take every single one of those numbers and turn it into a rate, like you see on Tennis Abstract. I don't have winners unforced errors for everything or anything really on the site except for the match starting project. But I turn everything into a rate. And what I'd probably do is I'd put it next to the season average or a tour average. So on the single match pages for the match charting project, if you mouse over any stat, you get the tour average on the surface, the player's career average, and the player's career average on the surface. So I realize most stats beyond the very basics, people just aren't familiar with, which is fine. I mean, everybody's got to start somewhere. I made some of these stats up, so I don't expect people to know what they are. So you need to have some kind of grounding in what they are. So, I mean, I don't think people even know what typical ace rates are. I mean, they might say, okay, clearly 20 aces is a good day. 1 ace, not a great day. Fine. But if you play a 2-set match and you hit 8 aces, is that good or bad? I mean, I don't know. Based on that question, even I don't know. It depends on how many points were played and so on. But I think that needs to be there all the time. One of the great things that there's a website called Baseball Savant that's run by Major League Baseball, and that has all these advanced stats we're talking about. And a lot of the stats, they have a color coding from like bright red to a deep blue, where if they've got some made up stat like a defensive efficiency type stat, then if it's really good, I think it's a deep red. If it's really bad, it's a deep blue. And obviously there's a range of values between those. So you only have to look at the number. It's like, okay, well, this is 47.3. What does that mean? Well, it's slightly red, so it's a little better than average. Or if we compare to his teammate down here, who's 42.1, is that still above average? Oh, that's just barely red. So all you need is the color and the number. I could probably do more of that with my site, but I mean, I think we could benefit from that in general. I mean, to me, it's all about context. I mean, even if we're talking about non-analytical things, like I always want to know, like, what is the context here? We can go on about any topic of the day, but really the question is, how does this compare to whatever we can compare it with. How does it stand up against other players of the past, other situations of the past, other tournaments of the past? And I mean, that's more important than anywhere else when you're talking about analytics.
I'll tell you mine, Jeff. Break points converted as it is, though it makes no sense because you can have break opportunities in one game and it went to 5 deuces and you broke serve and it says you're 1 for 5, but really you were in one return game and you broke. You did it. You're successful.
Yeah.
Or you can have break opportunities in 5 games, and every time, it's unlikely, but every time you had only one break chance and you only broke serve in one of those games. You're way more likely to be in a losing position in the match if you're 1 for 5, but you blew it on 5 return games versus if you just had if you had a couple break chances and you broke. So that stat is totally broken. It doesn't work at all. Right.
Yeah.
And then
I wrote that article for Tennis Magazine, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And I crunched the numbers on that. And I mean, there wasn't anything like groundbreaking there, because generally, like if you get a lot of break points in one game, you're going to get a lot of break points throughout. But you're right. Like there are some gaps. I think Nadal was the player who had the strongest like rate of breaking or getting break points per game. So when you cast things that way, I mean, this is 10 years ago. So of course, Nadal's going to look even better than he looks now. He looked even better when you cast things in those terms. And I think that number was a little bit more predictive from year to year too. So there's some benefit there. So I'm on board.
Second thing I love, especially as an analyst, where I'm trying to figure out what is happening in a match, are rally length stats. Who's winning the rallies that are ending in between 0 and 4 shots. Really, there's no 0 shot rallies, but
Double faults.
That's true. But that's the question is
I mean, it's not a rally.
It's a service shot. But yeah, basically,
people ask me this all the time. Let me just say, for the benefit of all you listeners, the serve is a shot. In analytical terms, anytime you see references to a 1-shot rally or 4-shot rally, the serve is a shot. Maybe you don't think the serve is a shot. Maybe you don't want the serve to be a shot. I don't care. The definition is set. You can't change it now. Serve is a shot.
Serve is a shot. Okay. Yeah, the rally length stats I like. I think they're informative about what's happening or what's happened in a match. So those are my 2 for the most part.
Yeah.
Besides the Hawkeye stuff.
Yeah, I like the rally length stuff too. And one thing I find interesting, I think it was the Shapovalov match in the ATP Cup final. Shapovalov ended up pretty much running away with that one. But at one point early in the second set or middle way through the second set, he and Carreño Busta were basically tied in the shortest rallies. And that's the sort of thing that nobody really expects. If you're going to predict who's going to do better in short rallies, it's Shapovalov. I mean, obviously, right? But on the other hand, everybody in tennis, with the exception of maybe Diego Schwartzman, has converted their game into something first strike-ish to the extent they can. The only players who don't are the ones who just can't do it and have to fight things out other ways. So everyone's trying to win quick points, and everybody does. I mean, even Schwartzman is getting 20-30% of free points on his serves most of the time from serves that don't come back or serves that come back weakly. So everybody's winning a lot of the really short points. Maybe like the Shapovalov first strikiness shows up in 3 and 4 shot rallies, and it does often. But the difference in that match was the middle range, the 5 to 8. And if you were to ask someone on the street, well, not on the street, nobody knows about Carreño Busta on the street, but if you were to ask somebody in the stadium, like who's going to win the 5 to 8 range, they'd probably pick Carreño Busta because they think Shapovalov's going to dominate the shortest range. But I mean, like I say, the shortest range is going to even out. Like there's rarely going to be a huge gap in the short range. So that middle range is where you can set yourself apart if you're not slogging things out. So those aren't like the signature serve +1 and the point shots for Shapovalov, but they're the ones where he didn't let things get dragged down. I mean, when they did get dragged down, that's where Carreño Busta ended up winning.
Yeah, there are misconceptions for sure. I was talking to someone and they were like, Djokovic must win the long points. That's why he's good, right? If you really look at a lot of his matches, he's dominating the short points because he's hitting deep returns and he's neutralizing the +1 play. So it goes both ways. It's not just offense wins short points. Defense in return can neutralize the short point battle as well, which is important for a player like Novak. Okay, I want to ask you, sharp left turn here. You have Peng Shuai up on the website, and it's been a while since she's come up on the show. So I just wanted to bring her up again. I know it was an issue that you are following and passionate about. What do you think is next in this story? It's obviously been overshadowed by not only just time elapsing, but also everything going on. But where do we go from here? Because it's been pretty quiet on that front.
I don't know. I mean, I wish I had a bigger platform so that it didn't get quiet. I mean, it's infuriating to hear the stupid crap we talk about every day when we could be doing that. On the other hand, I don't really know what the tennis world's pressure can accomplish. I mean, clearly the WTA managed to make some noise and that went up the chain. So the fact that the WTA took a step that ended in like the EU and the White House, making diplomatic requests, that's amazing. That blew my mind. I didn't think that would happen at all. And I'm afraid I'm not quite sure who puts pressure on the Chinese at this point. I mean, for fear of getting way too serious about this. I mean, when you look at horrible things that have happened in the past, you often want to point fingers and say that we should have known that there are these people who should have stepped in Rwanda, or these people who should have stepped in Europe in the 1930s. And yeah, I mean, there were opportunities. Absolutely. You can look at the historical record and say people should have done things differently. Fine. But here's an opportunity, not Peng Shuai necessarily. Maybe Peng Shuai isn't important enough to justify something geopolitically dangerous as taking on China would be. But I would say the situation in Xinjiang and the way that China is treating their ethnic minorities, I would say, if it might not be as bad as some of the other examples of genocidal behavior in the 20th and 21st century, but it's in the conversation. There's really nasty stuff going on, and it has been for a long time, and most of the world has known about it. So why is the world not taking on China more aggressively? I mean, that's a really tough question, but I mean, China is too powerful. I mean, it's too important to the rest of the world. We're too interconnected. China's got a super powerful military. They're not afraid to use it. They've got really good hackers. They're not afraid to use them. So taking on China beyond just making a diplomatic comment it carries a lot of risks. So whether you're talking about Peng Shuai, or you're talking about another dissident, or you're talking about ethnic minorities, then there's a huge cost benefit to weigh. And unfortunately, human rights usually loses in those conversations. It's horrible, but I don't know how to change that. I mean, I'm a tennis stats guy talking about this stuff. Of course, I don't know how to change it, but I don't know what the next step is. I don't know how you put pressure on someone to put pressure on someone who will eventually put pressure on the Chinese, because right now they're in a mode where they're going to make this Olympics happen. They're going to do absolutely whatever they have to do, no matter how many people have to be put in detention with coronavirus, no matter how many people have to be put in jail so they don't fly a banner supporting anything the Chinese government doesn't approve of, anything they have to censor online, they'll do it. They will stop at nothing to make this go off smoothly and make themselves look good. I don't know how you fight that. I wish I did. I got nothing.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add. I do think that I feel the same way in terms of the amount of power that the tennis world has at this point, and the fact that the story has stagnated. I don't know. I don't have an answer about what can be done about that either. It is interesting to see when the Olympics comes around what the cycle is going to be. Is it going to reemerge? And also, I just haven't heard much about the WTA in China. I haven't heard follow-ups about is it on television there? Are the Chinese players still getting funded? There's a lot of questions that I had when this was first happening and blowing up, and I haven't seen any follow-up reporting or kind of original information coming out. And I'm just kind of, I guess, staying tuned for it, but also just wondering kind of what the status is. So
yeah, I mean, obviously I don't really know anything about this stuff, but I mean, it seems like in the long run, maybe tennis is gone from China. I mean, I don't know, but it'll take some time before we get any answers on that. But in terms of the Chinese Tennis Federation and so on, like, authoritarian countries really care about their sporting profile, and obviously China is they might be as extreme a case as any country we've ever seen. They want to host the Olympics. They want to win lots and lots of medals. They're developing sports programs in sports that no one ever knew about in China before. I was just reading Li Na's biography this week, and apparently nobody knew about tennis where in Wuhan when she was growing up. They called it fuzzball because they just saw a fuzzy ball. The courts she played on were dirt courts, not clay, dirt, packed dirt. And this is, I mean, she's younger than I am. So that this is like 30 years ago that this is tennis in China, and look how far they've come. And they're doing this with every single Olympic sport. I mean, I live in Norway, and I'm hearing about, Norwegian coaches being drafted to help the Chinese become better biathletes or cross-country skiers. Like, they didn't care about that before, but once there's an Olympic medal on the line, they do. So when there's Olympic medals, when there's Asian Games medals and stuff like that on the line, then they'll keep funding it. I mean, maybe everybody will forget about this in a few years, and there'll be a premier mandatory or 1,000 WTA 1,000 in Shanghai or Wuhan again. Whatever it is, I can't imagine China deciding from their end, we're just going to give up on this one. We're not going to fund our players anymore. But you're right. I mean, those are interesting questions to keep an eye out for. And I'd be really surprised if we get anything at all until at least the Olympics is over, and probably a long time after that.
We will see. Another transition, probably should have reconsidered my orders of questions, but let's go back to tennis and the Australian Open. I want to do a quick comparison of the ELO rankings, and also if you could give like a 20-second explainer on, or primer on, ELO rankings and how they should be used and what they mean. And then let's compare them to how we actually feel about the contenders for the Australian Open.
Okay, I give you no guarantees on 20 seconds, but I'll do my best. Okay, so the idea of ELO ratings is you rate players based on who they beat, not when they win matches. The way the ATP rankings work is based on, you get more points by winning a final than a semifinal and so on. With ELO ratings, if you beat Djokovic in the first round, you get the same number of points as you get from beating Djokovic in a final. 250, Grand Slam, doesn't matter. Beating Djokovic is beating Djokovic. All that matters is your opponent's rating. So it's a made up number, but everybody starts with 1,500 points, and the number of points you move from winning or losing a match depends on the quality of the player you're playing against. So if you lose to Djokovic, your rating doesn't move much. I mean, if you're me and your rating is like 7, unless that's a bad example. If you're the number 100 player in the world, your rating might be, let's say, 1,700. Djokovic's is 2,100 or so. If you lose to Djokovic, we know you're going to lose to Djokovic. The idea is, we knew before you were not as good as Djokovic. You weren't even close. Nobody expected you to win. Losing gives us no more information about you. So your rating doesn't change very much. The whole idea is, with every match played, we get more information about a player. The more new information we get, the more we change their rating. So beating Djokovic is huge. Losing to him, not huge. The advantage there is, for one thing, they're simply better at predicting match outcomes than ATP rankings or WTA rankings. Just way better. If you're a gambler and all you have is one system or the other, go with ELO. It's not even close. One reason for that, apart from the whole the philosophical difference of who you beat versus when you win, the main reason for that is ELO ratings tell you how a player is doing right now. I mean, if you beat Djokovic yesterday in a final, then it will be in the next Monday's ELO ratings. If you're a better programmer than me and you update them every day, it doesn't even have to be a final. Like, your match yesterday affects your rating today. The ATP rankings, everything is equally weighted for the last 12 months, or in the case of COVID-19, they're equally weighted for like 13 years. I don't know how the system works now, but it stretches out over even more time. So effectively what that means is, a player's ATP rating or ranking is where they were at 6 months ago. It's a weighted average of how they were playing 6 months ago, because it has last week's results, but it also has 51 weeks ago results. So it's not bad. The ATP rankings are fine at what they do. and they work for tournament entries, but they don't tell you how a player's playing right now, where Elo basically does, because the number of points you get for winning a match yesterday effectively ends up being more than the number of points you get from winning the same match 6 months ago. So that's how it works, why it works.
I'm glad you didn't follow the 20-second rule, because that was good.
Okay.
That was I learned some things about Elo, and I used it and I learned some things. Okay, let's start with the women, and we'll run through the top 10. Barty's number one. She's my favorite. She your favorite?
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
not
she has to be,
necessarily,
right?
and it's not necessarily a pick. It's just, we're kind of going through tiers of contendership. Tough draw. She has Osaka, but we'll get to her later. Contivate's number two, and this goes kind of to Elo ratings valuing recent performance, but there was an offseason wedged in the middle. So do you think that's too high?
I want to say yes, but I'm not sure who you put ahead of her. That's always the trick is Kontaveit doesn't look like a number two player to me, but I'm not sure who else does. And to your point about the offseason, there is a factor there, but I think I looked at this, and you would expect that rankings like this would be a little less predictive early in the season, because we don't know what players did in the off. I mean, did they spend their whole time in the Maldives? Did they work really hard? I don't know. But I think I looked at this, and there wasn't much of a difference. It isn't like there were a bunch of surprise results in January. So maybe, I mean, I should probably look at it again or write it up, but I'm not sure there's much there. So, I mean, I don't see a good reason not to let Kontaveit be number two.
Okay. I like the number three a little bit better than her. And by the way, just to clarify, hardcourt Elo for anyone following along at home, not regular Elo, because
Okay.
Aussie's on a hardcourt. Muguruza is someone who I think might be one of those players above Kontaveit for me, and I like her as a top three contender. And by the way, you don't need to expand on everyone. We can run through it pretty fast. Okay. Osaka is number four, and I'm there on that. She looked good last week. We know what she's done. We know she can blow anyone off the court.
And I think with Osaka, I would have to check, but I think there's a penalty built into her rating right now. And this is not pure Elo. Like, Elo was invented by a Hungarian mathematician for chess, and it's a very mathematical thing. And I don't claim to fully understand every aspect of it, but just for tennis, I built in some penalties for missing time, because if a player gets injured, we don't know how they play when they come back, right? But effectively, the average player is worse after an injury, at least in the beginning. So if a player misses a lot of time over certain thresholds, I dock their Elo by 100 points or a little more than 100 points until they come back and start playing matches again. When they start playing matches again, I let their rating move more. So if somebody comes back and they're playing great, then their ranking might bounce back very quickly, but it does drop. And I think there's a 100-point penalty in there for Osaka right now. So if she hadn't missed so much time in 2021, then I think she'd be number two, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yep. I think that would make sense, just from trying to think about the hard court results that she was able to obtain. Okay. I'm going to run through the rest of the top 10, and let's see if anything kind of strikes us as high, low. The next is Victoria Azarenka, Simona Halep, Arina Sabalenka, Maria Sakkari, Karolina Pliskova. And then Ons Jabeur rounds off the top 10. Obviously, you have Sabalenka that kind of is dealing with the serve issues. I know you're a big fan. She's probably too high in terms of too low. I don't know. I don't know if anyone jumps off to me as too low off of first glance.
Yes, Sabalenka is a good example of how the system works, in that she lost a lot of points for losing to Kaya Juvan. I mean, that's a bad loss. And in terms of the way I was talking about it before, we learned a lot by her losing to Juvan. That tells us she's not playing well at all. Maybe she'll bounce back, but at least on that day, she's playing horribly. I mean, I don't have the Rebecca Peterson loss in her in the Elo ratings yet, but that'll be another pretty substantial dock. So that's why she's there. I think pretty recently she was as high as number 2 in both overall and hard court elo, and deservedly so. But she had a bad Guadalajara. She's had a couple bad matches here, and that tells you something. So I don't know. One thing to keep in mind when looking at these is look at the actual numbers. And one thing that's been true of the WTA for, I mean, we're going on at least a few years now, is there's not a big gap here. I mean, looking at the hard court elo, there's 30 points between Barty and Kontaveit, another 40 points between Kontaveit and Muguruza. That means something. I mean, that it's not a huge gap, but I mean, it's something. But then after that, it's basically 10 points to Osaka, 20 points to Azarenka. That's still a little bit, but then Azarenka and Halep are basically tied. Sabalenka, Sakari are basically tied. They're basically tied with Pliskova. She's basically tied with the Jabeur. I mean, yes, they're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on the list, but really, I mean, it's foolish to pretend like those numbers are so precise. Like
Right.
if you round everything to the nearest 10, that probably gives you the amount of precision that we really know. So those ladies are all tied for 6th in my mind. And that feels about right. I don't know how to put, a strong and rising Sakari next to a resurgent Simona Halep. I mean, I buy that they're about the same. That seems right to me, but I'm not going to pretend that I know which one is a little bit better or which one's likely to win if they play in the quarterfinals next week.
Yeah, the best way to do this, and I know I do this a lot. I know Gruskin, who we've given too much airtime to today, does this as well, is you put players in tiers. So definitely a big fan of that. I mean, you can go down the list. I mean, I would say Swiatek, who I didn't name because she was 11, Badosa, who is 13. Both players who both players who I wouldn't be too surprised if they went all the way and made a huge run compared to someone who's, Azarenka at number 5 in this ELO ranking. So yeah, it is tight.
Yeah, and to give an idea there, the gap between number 1 Ashley Barty and number 3 Muguruza in hardcourt ELO is basically the same as Muguruza to number 13 Badosa. So to say that Badosa is a contender, I mean, I agree with you. I think I was even picking her as far back as the US Open to make a big run. You're not making a super bold call here, according to ELO. I mean, it's a little bit bolder than saying Muguruza, but I mean, she's in the mix. This is a very good era to be number 13. If you're going to have to pick an era to be number 13 in.
Not as much on the men's side, right? Where I would be shocked if, let's go to 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Schwartzman.
Yeah.
That won't happen.
Although, I agree with Schwartzman, but we take out a couple of the players who are not playing. I've got Federer, Thiem, and Brooksby all above them in the ratings. So if you go Auger Aliassime at 14, Berrettini at 15, are you going to be shocked by either of those two?
It's just now, I would say I'm splitting hairs. I would say Felix, there's an unknown factor of is he really as good as he looked last week? And if the answer is yes, then no, I wouldn't be surprised if he can just play at that level. For Berrettini, the weird thing about him is I feel so comfortable that he'll be in the quarters or he'll be in the semis. But Berrettini Medvedev, I just can't. He doesn't seem very threatening to the players who return his serve well and out rally him at a very high rate. Zverev, Djokovic, Medvedev. Like Berrettini doesn't tend to beat them, and so that's the thing about him. It's like you go far, but in my eyes, he's a big underdog at the end.
That sounds right to me. Yeah, but he still is. He's number 15 on this list. So that's a strong number 15. Yeah. If you think if you're not surprised to see him in the semifinal or even the final.
And he's probably one of the weird cases. I could check it, but he's probably higher in clay and grass, known traditionally as the two polars, and then hard court's probably his lowest elo.
Yeah, let me see. It looks like he's about number 6 or 7 in clay, and then number 4 on grass, which you'd expect. So yeah, that's right. And that seems like that's just a matter of time, right? He just needs to get a couple big results on hard court that he hasn't had yet compared to the other surfaces.
Yep. Seems like the kind of thing that would change for sure. So Medvedev, Djokovic, and Zverev on the top, and they are the only three with a 2 in front of their number. The rest is 1, and it seems like there's a gap between those three and everyone else on hard court, especially if you look at 2021. Pretty much every event was a copy paste.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And again, yeah, it's so important to look at the numbers there. Like, I'm surprised more people haven't commented on the fact that Medvedev has been number 1 for a little while in the hard court ELO, which means he's the favorite in my forecast for the tournament. But I mean, they're separated by 4 points. So I mean, let's just say they're tied.
Okay, there are shockers here, I think, for some people.
Yeah,
which is, and I'm gonna ignore Federer.
Yeah, I don't think he's likely to win.
No. And I'm gonna ignore Federer and team who are still high. Sinner is next. Alcaraz is after Sinner. So I mean, Elo loves they're not prospects anymore. That's not fair. Elo loves the youngsters who had really strong, ends of 2021. After that is Tsitsipas and Ruud and Nadal, Brooksby, Rublev. Do you feel that Sinner and Alcaraz have a better chance to win Australia than some of the more traditional guys or the guys like Rublev and Tsitsipas who are higher in the rankings?
I don't know. It's tough. It's something that I struggle with, especially with Alcaraz. Alcaraz is a good example of where one place where Elo might not be great is so one of the things about Elo is because we're updating our rating with every match played. Early in a player's career, matches count for more. I mean, because if you think about Djokovic now, we know who Djokovic is. Like, he's played 1,000 whatever matches. Like, no matter what happens in his next match, we're not going to learn that much about Djokovic. With Alcaraz, he hasn't played that many challenger or tour level matches. Like, I don't know what the number is, but it's probably 10% of Djokovic. So we don't know very much about him in those terms. So every match we learn a lot more. So what that means is if he does something like the next gen finals where he reels off 5 wins against pretty credible opponents, then according to Elo, we've learned a lot about him, and it's all positive. So players who are on a winning streak, especially very young players who are on a winning streak, Elo gets super excited about them. And probably too excited. So okay. Alcaraz seems high. With Sinner, though, I mean, he's been high for a long time. I mean, Elo had him in the top 10 before he was anywhere close to the top 10 in the ATP rankings. Traditionally, anybody who cracks the top 10 on the Elo makes the ATP top 10. There's a few exceptions, but very, very few in history. So when Elo makes a big call like that, it tends to be right. It might be early, but it tends to be right. So I want to separate those two. Alcaraz, I'm willing to say, okay, the system is maybe a little overexcited. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stephanie Kowalczyk, who worked at Tennis Australia, and she's written some academic papers on tennis. She's stats on the tee. She's a lot better at the hardcore statistics than I am. She uses a lot of tools that I don't even understand, and she's done some analysis of using Elo ratings, but with margin of victory. So essentially, you treat every game as a win or a loss, or every set as a win or a loss, or even every point instead of every match. So instead of saying Alcaraz was undefeated at the next gen finals, you say Alcaraz won 70% of his games or 66% of his points, whatever. I'm making up those numbers, but whatever they are. And what that means is that means that every player has some recent losses. I mean, I think Stephanie's goal in doing that was not what we're talking about here. She wasn't trying to fix this problem, but it is one way of approaching it. In that way, you don't have young players who are on these undefeated streaks, because nobody's on an undefeated streak in tennis except for really tiny ones. You lose a lot of points, you lose a lot of games. That's just the nature of the beast. So that's one possible solution. But Sinner, he at least at the end of the season, he wasn't on a winning streak. So I think he's legit. Whether you want to get into slam experience. I mean, if Sinner and Nadal is a quarter, I don't know when they're supposed to play each other, but let's say Sinner and Nadal were a quarterfinal. I don't know whether I pick Sinner then in my heart. I would have a hard time picking Sinner in that match, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he wins it. I mean, that's the thing about young players waiting for a breakthrough. We know he's going to break through. I mean, it seems like he's pretty sure to win a slam at some point. I mean, that's a big call, but for any player, but it seems likely. So whenever he breaks through, I'm not going to be surprised. For any individual slam, I don't want to say like, this is obviously the time that Jannik Sinner is going to make his first final. I mean, you can't say that about anybody, but he's at that level where you're not going to be surprised if this is the time.
Yeah, well, sometimes this stuff can happen really quickly, sometimes slowly, like Medvedev. But I'm kind of on Elo's level on Alcaraz. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I don't know if I don't know, I'm not that far off from it. I'll say that. So,
and again, you got to look at who you're comparing him to. Like, there are reasons to doubt Tsitsipas right now. I mean, Casper Ruud on a hard court. I mean, I live in Norway, so I can't be anti-Casper, but still, I mean, you can't get too excited. Nadal, there's doubts about his health. Rublev, I mean, you really think Rublev is going to win 7 matches in a row? Auger-Aliassime, you made the point before. Berrettini, we're still waiting on him to beat big players. You go down the list, like, which of those guys are you willing to say he's definitely above Alcaraz? I mean, it's a tough time to make those judgments on the ATP.
Yeah, it is. And that's why I think people have a misconception right now that things have been blown open with the vulnerability of Federer and Nadal, because and team going out with injury last year, because Medvedev and Zverev and Djokovic have been unbelievably consistent and difficult to beat. So I don't see the men's side as some kind of newly wide open thing. There's a lot of takes going around that if you're like a Pablo Carreño Busta, you're licking your chops right now. And I don't really see it that way.
I'm glad I'm not following those people on Twitter. I haven't heard that take, but I'm not sure about that.
I guess, let me be more specific than to name drop one player. There are for the lost gen or the mad gen, the 30-year-old gen, there's some sentiment that now this is their chance. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's right.
Yeah, I guess you can. The way I would make that argument, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it, is, okay, let's say hypothetically Djokovic gets kicked out of the country. I mean, it could still happen. So then you have not big 3, you've got a big 2, and the big 2 is not including Djokovic. So you've got Medvedev and Zverev on opposite halves at that point. So would you pick any of those players to beat Medvedev or Zverev? No, I wouldn't pick any of them. But Zverev in best of 5, Medvedev can, lose his mind at any warning. People can beat them. They're not guaranteed. And they don't, that's the thing. Like, it's more clear on the women's game than the men's game. But I've been saying this for a decade now. Like, to win a slam, you don't have to beat the best players. You have to beat 7 players, and we don't know who they are yet. So I was just, again, I was looking at Li Na yesterday, and her last slam, she didn't beat anybody above the 20th seed. So she beat some good players, including a young Belinda Bencic. But I mean, she didn't have to go through Serena and Victoria Azarenka. You have to beat the players who are in front of you. So would you be shocked if Zverev got knocked out by like Hurkacz in the 4th round and Medvedev lost to Alcaraz in the quarterfinal? I mean, you'd be surprised, but it isn't like Federer and Nadal are out of 2012 Wimbledon. It's not that level of thing. So back in the serious big 4 days, like, if 2 of those guys lost, well, okay, the other 2 will play in the final. And maybe there's Tsonga and there's Wawrinka and there's Nishikori and there's Del Potro waiting to pounce. So if you're Carreño Busta, you don't have a chance. There's no chops to lick. But now if Medvedev and Djokovic don't make it to the semis, then sure. I mean, why not Carreño Busta? Why not Sinner? I mean, go down the list, pick whatever name you want. Why not Sebastian Korda? I mean, it is anybody's game. So it's just, I think it's more about the number of big names at the top rather than who they are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Once you're down to 2 superpowers, then a lot can happen. I agree with that. But then if you have 3 in there, that's 33% more. Is that math right?
33%. Yeah. Well, if you have 3, it's 50% more.
2
you
to 3
from 2 to 1. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're right. See, this is very embarrassing. Let's end on that. Let's end on you schooling me in math that's just a fitting way to do this, because that's why we have you on as the dude who understands the numbers and not me. I just read the numbers.
I'm glad I caught the mistake. Your listeners would be doubting me pretty hard. I was like, yes, 1 is 33% of 2.
Look,
Okay, close one.
It's tough. You put it in a fraction, and that makes 33.
But I don't think people understand the type of pressure we're under. There's voices in our ears giving us material. There's distractions. We're all watching press conferences in Australia. I mean, we're looking at ELO ratings online. Like, there's a lot going on that simple arithmetic it's not simple in these circumstances. This is hard work that you do, Gill.
Yeah, my heart rate's been like 120 for this entire hour and 10 minutes.
Is
Jeff,
that high? I don't know.
I think that's high.
Yeah, it's relatively high.
Pretty sure that's high.
Like,
it's exercising, I believe.
I mean, if this isn't exercise, what is?
Yeah, I agree. Well, look, we're probably wrong about that, because we don't have anyone who knows about that on here.
Obviously not.
But hopefully we knew some other stuff. And no, but this was a lot of fun. I'm glad we could talk shop. These are conversations that I've been wanting to have with you about numbers in the sport, and it lived up to the hype in my book, Jeff. So hopefully we can do it again soon. And thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Gill.